This is not strictly speaking an algorithmic model advancement. It's not a new architecture, but a really supremely executed, pirouette where different tricks were used to get to a composite thing that's as good as anything else, which is a real feat of engineering, right?
So, Chinese AI company DeepSeek has dropped its open source R1 model, and it's got the world in an uproar. From massive tech sell offs to bloodthirsty chatbot arena crowds, it's hitting number one in consumer app stores, and yet it's all built on old chips and around, $7 million in capital? Welcome to the Deep Learning with PolyAI podcast, the only podcast built on a lot more than old chips and $7 million. With me, as usual, is Nikola Merchik, co founder and CEO of PolyAI. How are you, Nikola?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. We're kind of doing a little bit of a breaking story here with all the hullabaloo that's going on around DeepSeek's dropping of R1.
I mean,
Wanted to get your opinion as
it's supposed the NVIDIA share price, so I think we're a bit late.
yeah. If you are concerned with that thing, as Nicola mentioned, you are listening a bit too late. Wanted to chat about what's going on. First of all, kind of diving into what exactly is R1, why is it causing such a stir? What are some of the differentiators between it and other LLMs? And then kind of going into some of its effects that we've seen so far in these 7 days since its release. So without further ado, let's just dive right in and figure out what is DeepSeek and what is their R1 model.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think in a nutshell, it's a new open source model that has matched or even exceeded on a bunch of benchmarks models from OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta. Very small model trained on gaming GPUs, where, I think they claimed that the cumulative investment is something like $5 million,
Yeah, somewhere on there.
which is next to nothing. There are people at OpenAI paying more. So I think it's kind of like sent the whole world in a bit of a panic. I think, yeah. Andreessen called it AI Sputnik moment. I mean, from the reactions on X, it looks more like the moon landing, right? But I think that through a lot of really smart engineering, they built a model that's really good, right? Like they use things like quantization, a mixture of expert model. They're kind of like training on paragraphs, not just on like single tokens. Then kind of like if we were to use analogies, it's are you using your whole brain to like do every single task? You're training a single person to be a doctor, a lawyer, a poet, whatever, mathematician, or do you just kind of like have different parts of brain, right? Different parameters used for different tasks, and then you learn kind of like to evoke them, and you create more specialized models that need fewer parameters, therefore less data, less less training hardware required because they train for a shorter amount of time. They learn faster, right? So
So is this model when we think of traditional LLMs and sort of the anti-LLM movement towards SLMs, which was more or less taking a restricted data set, but still that constructed the entirety of the model's training. Is this saying you still have it? It still is trained on a massive amount, but for specific use cases, it's sort of like fine tuned to those use cases more effectively and efficiently.
well, it's more elegant than that, right? It's a single
I'm
model.
not a very elegant person. I understand.
No. It's more elegant in that it's not really like a model, a set of disjoint models used for different things. It is trained at once. It's just kind of like turning different parameters on and off, and it's learning to do that on its own, right? So it's still an LLM, right? It's
Sure.
still a large model. This model is no joke, right? It's still a very large model. It's just
Hmm.
not as large and demanding or trained in the same way as others, right? I think, the other trick that is often used with other LLMs at inference time, so at runtime, is something known as quantization, where you basically don't use, say, 32-bit or 64-bit uh, floating point representation. And instead, you basically round it up to like 8 digits, 8 decimal digits, right? Which means that basically the computations are a bit less accurate, but still like good enough, right? Now, it's usually used at inference time to allow it to run faster or on like, weaker devices, maybe in your phone, right? Or computer rather than a, collection of hundreds of, $40,000 GPUs that are used for training. It's a form of like compression. What they used it for is for training as well. And they still got it to work, right? It's because of this, like, mixture of expert or this like multi-token like training procedure they use. But I think the coolest thing is they've released the whole thing, right? So
Mm.
it's not the classic kind of like closed OpenAI model where it's like, here's a model, here's how it performs. You can validate and use it to confirm the evaluation, but you can't really see how it works on it. Uh, this thing is out there. So, I think that all of the Western AI companies, I've seen Jan LeCun was kind of like the head of research at Meta posting about it. For them, it's a moral victory because Meta was always the one pushing open source models. So,
Right.
it's a lot of people, a lot of media are framing it as like, a geopolitical victory for China. I think it's a victory for open source, right? And a victory for
Oh,
that.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the question is, and you mentioned this, they sort of released it all. Why? It doesn't seem like a very Chinese move for a nation that's notoriously protective of its IP and sort of insular about it. What what's the play here?
Um, if you're asking Nikola, the Serbian conspiracy theorist, I'll disappoint you. I don't really have one. I think the only way you can interpret it is it's a real kind of like, you know, show of force in that it's like, not only are we going to show that we are on par with less resources and, the scarcity breeds that innovation, but we're going to go a step further and just like show you how it's done, kind of like release it all. Um, and, I mean, if you really, the Serbian conspiracy theorist is waking up, um, it's a bit like the Belt and Road Initiative, where I think China is winning hearts and minds in large parts of the world by not like talking about rule of law and similar things, but instead just providing, infrastructure. Well, what better way than to provide for free to everyone the infrastructure of the future that also runs on, anyone's laptop a lot more easily than the bulky American model that's really, really, really expensive and you have to pay someone to use it, right? So it's going to get interesting. It's very interesting, right? I mean, there's a
Yeah.
world in which I actually think that the drop in share prices of those with the most AI exposure is actually not even that serious, right? It's definitely a blow to like the foundational layer.
Yeah, let's talk about that drop in share prices. It obviously had some market effects domestically here in the States. Nvidia's stock price took a tank in a massive tech sell-off.
I
Uh,
mean, well, that massive,
it's going to bounce back, right?
15%. Like it's not, they're like 1 or something like that.
I mean, by scale, they're topping the top 15, like loss in market value just based on their size alone. But
No, no, no.
uh,
Greatest of all time, I think, actually.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
they're,
exactly.
yeah.
Do you think these are long-standing effects? Do you think this is a gut reaction to the fear that's imposed by, again, China like dropping an open source model that's this performative on basically built on, duct tape? Is this something that we should that is going to have long-standing concern, or is it more of a boon to the AI industry?
I think it's a well, I mean, I think it's a boon for AI adoption and like a big step towards like this. I mean, it's a step towards also multipolar world in a sense, in that, there are multiple parties capable of these kinds of advances. I'm no Wall Street analyst, so,
Right. That should be the
people are going to
disclaimer.
price, I mean, they're going to price this in however they think, um, is suitable, and the next, you know, news hype will have a different effect, right? I mean, AI is here to stay. NVIDIA provides the thing that was used to train these things as well, right? Maybe
Mhm.
just fewer of them. So, the house always wins, except in this case, the gambler can come in with a lot of money and came out with a lot of winning, right? Uh,
Well, you said that it would, it was reported that these were built on gaming GPUs. Is
yeah,
this really the house's advantage still to NVIDIA, or can cheaper chip makers now kind of throw their hat in the ring?
yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? I think it really, if sustainable, if we don't get like a major advance by throwing more compute at the problem, uh, you know, God knows, right? I mean, in terms of how it was trained, I don't know if that whole thing and dataset was released. Altman, continues to kind of say like, the hardest bit is like getting to it and then, imitating is a lot easier, right? It's kind of like that anecdote about the first person to run 100 meters in under God knows how many seconds. And then the next year you had like 7 more people doing it, right? Because they knew it was possible. So I don't think this in any way like reduces the achievements of previous LLMs of GPT-3, GPT-4, right? Or one. But it definitely, we don't know what it was trained on because if it's a distilled version, or even, if you had a training procedure that got there, but, maybe in the meantime used data or, just kind of like overall meta level guidance from other work they might have done but not disclosed, that used GPT-4 or other leading LLMs to guide their training process, that then would be mischievous, right? And definitely still impressive in that it's like a really, you know, it's an achievement to do it with less hardware, if it is with less hardware. In any case, they released something really good to open source. If you flip it on that side, then really, in that game of like competing for a better model, then Meta is the loser, right? Because they've done the most in the open source game to
Right.
release those models, and now someone else is better. But I don't think so. I think they're like, they wrote the game, and imitation is from the flattery. So, um, I think this is good for the ecosystem broadly, right? For AI adoption, for interest in it, for getting even more people to work because you don't just have to get a job at OpenAI or Anthropic to have the kind of resources to play the game.
Right.
Um, and that's cool, right? I mean, uh, that was always, I think, the appeal of computer science, right? That unlike, say, in physics, where if you wanted to be an experimental physicist, you got to get a job at CERN or whatever, go build your own Large Hadron Collider. And that's pretty expensive and difficult. The appeal of computer science was always that, someone sitting in the room could like uh, think of something clever and, make an algorithmic advancement. This is not strictly speaking an algorithmic model advancement. It's not a new architecture, but a really supremely executed, pirouette where different tricks were used to get to a composite thing that's as good as anything else, which is a real feat of engineering, right? This is above
Yeah.
all really, really inspiring feat of engineering by those guys. No matter if they use GPT-4 or not.
Right. I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around communist nation makes massive move to democratize AI. I can't. It's I want to know like what's behind the curtain. I want to know what the next move is. What this was it just an industry disruption? Was it just to sort of shake up the West, the existing technology powerhouses, and say, hey, not for Meta's benefit, but kind of to spite the others instead. It's hard for me to conceptualize what the long
Listen,
term is
Damien,
here.
as the grandson of two Yugoslav partisans, one of whom was actually, I think, ideologically communist, and I'm appropriately dressed here. I mean, I'll take the opposing side, right?
Red shirt.
If, if you really, and many people think that she, and especially kind of like in these like later terms, really is moving away from a kind of like a free market capitalist China into a communist one. There's definitely you know, a number of profound communist beliefs in the current Chinese regime, right? Uh, One of them would be, like egalitarianism and like the right for all to have the access to the same thing, right? So releasing this is very much in line with, right? And I think that,
Especially with its non-commercial pursuits.
yeah, I mean, like also, it's hard to know exactly what's on the other side, but
Right.
this startup, right? This is not Baidu. This is not
Right.
Tencent. This is not Alibaba, right? Like this is a quant hedge fund, which is not by itself a very communist thing to have, right? So again, I think China's model is interesting. I mean, it's like, I don't know, an $8 billion quant hedge fund. I mean, that sounds more like something like Jane Street or Jump or GSA than, Citadel, Renaissance. And, those places, I mean, like throughout my undergrad and PhD, the smartest kids were getting like quant hedge fund jobs and decided to opt out of the whole thing. It wasn't easy because not only did you have to be smart, you had to be fast, right? You had to
Right.
be really good at probability and maths and classical like problem solving. Um, I mean, those guys are the highest. Those are the highest paid entry level jobs that exist on the planet,
Right.
right? So it's not really a surprise, and I think someone from Anthropic wrote about like, hey, look, I mean, regardless of anything, the concentration of talent, which is, if you look at like the future vector of an LLM company, right? Talent is arguably more important than the supply of just LLMs. Well, I mean, now these guys have proven, at least for this level in the race, right? For
Right.
this, for the Sputnik moment, right? So they have like serious talent. So on
So
that level,
maybe this was winning a race where there was no prize money, but knowing that the sponsorships are gonna
well,
be
listen,
coming
I
in.
mean, the compensation of those guys working on it, right? 200
Right.
people. There's a lot of, I mean, what would media be if not sensationalist, right?
Oh,
Uh,
no, sure.
so, they're like, hey, OpenAI has 3,000 people, and these guys only have 200. I mean, DeepMind had 200 people in the supply, maybe less, maybe 100. Like OpenAI up until recently had like 1,000 people, and then fewer, right? They were already what they were when they were a few hundred people.
Yeah,
And, the what's that law? It's a permutation of the Pareto principle, where basically if you have n people in the company, the root of n people do have to work, right? So, if you've got 400 people, 20 people do have to work, right?
right,
Uh, and then it's interesting, right? Because it means basically the scaling law of adding people, and I think many people in many companies feel this as they grow. The scaling law is definitely not linear. It's definitely like sublinear, and adding people actually slows you down in the first instance, because instead of doing their best work, your superstars are figuring out how to manage people, and half of them realizing that they really hate it, or that uh, it's a waste of time or not what they'd like to do, and it's just um, a world where those guys are just working on what they're really good at is a world where they're more productive initially, right?
yeah. No, very good point. Hey, earlier you mentioned Mark Andreessen calling this AI's Sputnik moment. Obviously referencing that sort of technological sleepers, and in this case for the international space race and cornerstone moments therein. Is this the one, or is this the first of many with regards to Western shakeups to what's possible without those Western resources?
I mean, on an engineering level, it's a Sputnik moment, and that with far less resources, the achievement was matched. On a profound like capability level, it is not a Sputnik moment, because
Okay,
the capabilities are not more advanced, right? It is just more efficient, right?
right.
So, um, yeah, I mean, it's what it means for the future. I'm not really sure. It means that China is a force to be reckoned with, and that the perceived, um, you know, at least 2 to 5 year advantage, which many people claimed, is not really there. Not for
Right.
now, right? So the race is on. I think many companies in the West are working to, compete with each other, and not with these guys. So, um, there's definitely a new kid on the block. So we'll see. We'll see who wins the most Grand Slams here. But um, I think if they were all committed to open source, it would probably be more interesting, right?
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see what it means. We'll see how other Chinese groups deliver. I mean, going back to like my high school programming competition days, I mean, the Chinese are fiercely competitive. Right? I would not be surprised if another 5 groups in China now start beating these results in a matter of months, right? And then I think you have to like hire. I mean, if you were really to be a propagandist here, like you could do wonderful memoirs on behalf of CCP by talking about the American companies' ecological footprint and what they're doing with spending, 500 trillion or
True.
whatever, 500 billion uh,
500 billion.
to um, to train these things while these guys do pirouettes and match the performance. So look, I think it's fun, right? It's good for the field.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned a little bit about being good for the open source movement as a whole. Is this going to redefine AGI as traditional AGI, which is more or less performance based, as opposed to what OpenAI and Microsoft established AGI to be, which is technologies that's worth $100 billion?
I mean, I don't think this decreases the value of AI at all. It might decrease, you know, uh, share price upticks of those companies that depended on huge upfront capex, right? It may get, I mean, I can tell you that Mindbox exploded from venture capitalists who are now like, oh, wait, maybe it's not all being disrupted. Maybe there is differentiation in, you know, test specific modeling in the application layer. So look, I think it's all going to go back and forth a few times. Um, the world is different. We have models and capabilities that we couldn't dream of like 3, 4 years ago. This is all good.
All right. Any other thoughts on DeepSeek R1?
No, I see that. I didn't even manage to download. I think like at the moment they've suspended registration because they can't cope with the demand. So maybe they'll get some more gaming GPUs so they can service the whole world. But we'll see.
We shall see. All right. And for the rest of you, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming here soon. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Deep Learning with PolyAI. Take care.